Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to those of you from Europe who are attending our webcast today, and also those of you from the US. Thanks for joining us. I'm delighted to welcome you today to our webcast on the subject of harnessing employee data, striking the right balance between values, ethics, and regulation. So I'm Marion Devine. I'm a senior researcher here at the Conference Board, and I'll be your moderator for today's webcast. So before we begin, let me just quickly run through some sort of housekeeping rules about or guidance about today's platform. I'd like to just say, if you would like to ask questions as they occur via the chat box at the bottom left of your screen, we'll weave them into the conversation when we can see good opportunities to do that, and we'll follow up an email if we can't answer some of those questions. You can download the presentation via the file download pod in the bottom center of your screen. You can have full screen at any time just by clicking the 4 arrows that you'll see on your screen. And please do think about completing the evaluation form that we have at the end of the webcast, because we really find that very useful. It's really good to hear from you. We like to look at that as we design future webcasts. And feel free to share this webcast with your colleagues. It will be available on demand to anyone on our website after the webcast, I think within about 24 hours. Those of you who are earning credits, you just have to type in your full name, your email address. You have to click OK for the 3 pop-ups that occur during the program, and you do need to stay on the program because credit is available for participation in the live webcast only. So without more ado, I'd like to get started on today's webcast. So in the studio today, I'm very happy to introduce Tom DeGaudier.
Hi, Marion.
Hi, Tom. It's great that Tom is here to be with us. He is a seasoned lawyer, and it's great that we have got a specialist with us. So Tom is a data and technology lawyer with a strong focus on data privacy law, technology, IT and telecommunications law, and technology-related IP. So I think Tom is really going to be, it's great that we've got you here, and I do hope that our audience will feel that they can ask you questions.
Pleasure.
Put you on the spot. And we also have attending virtually Klaas Toes. Klaas has been associated with the Conference Board for a very long time. He's been our program director for a group that we have that meet together our member companies on the subject of human capital analytics. And he's also led former big data working group. And Klaas is the founder and CEO of the ROI Institute Europe. And this is an organization that calculates the investment in human capital, often in learning or performance improvement and change initiatives. So I think that must be extremely interesting work that you do. So welcome, Klaas.
Thank you all. Welcome to everybody.
Okay, so today I'd just like to set the scene really for you as we go into the webcast. And I don't know if the audience can see our slides. Yeah, okay, great. So first of all, I think I'd just like to sort of say that we started researching into the GDPR, the changing landscape of privacy and data protection last year, and very much in response to our member companies who were really concerned about some of the very sweeping changes that were going on, not just in Europe, but right around the world. And I think something that we've seen that's very interesting is that when we first started talking to companies, I think companies were kind of fairly confident, actually. They were saying, yes, we're getting our ducks in a row, you know, we're going to be compliant, etc. And actually, a year and a half on from the GDPR, I think we're actually finding that the world has changed. We're in a different landscape, and it keeps changing. And just to sort of give a sort of reality check, Capgemini Research Institute did a very interesting survey at the beginning of 2019. And the results of the survey has found that companies have vastly overestimated their readiness for the GDPR. And they found that while in 2018, 78% expected to be prepared by the time the regulation came into effect, But actually, this year, when asked again, only 28% say that they have achieved compliance. So that's a very big fall, and it seems that companies have been overly optimistic about being prepared. And there are various challenges that they identified in this survey, and one of them was the whole challenge of aligning legacy IT systems, and we've seen that again and again when companies have really had to make very big changes. The complexity of the GDPR, especially in terms of some of the ambiguity, the untested areas of this new regulation, the cost just of having to implement various measures that the law requires companies to do. So it's not just sort of compliance, it's also some of your internal systems and processes, and you have to appoint a data protection officer, etc. And also something I think that perhaps people didn't expect that this survey picks up is the volume of queries from data subjects, i.e. customers and employees. This has been actually quite high. So 50% of US companies covered by the GDPR have received over 1,000 queries. 46% of French companies, 45% in the Netherlands, and 40% in Europe. So it seems that across the landscape, individuals are perhaps being more active than we appreciated. And we've also seen some big companies like Google, British Airways, Marriott, even PwC, being fined for not complying with the GDPR. So we're in an interesting time, I think. So looking at the next slide, I think that when it comes to what we're seeing really is that GDPR has some big implications, and the continuing change of regulation has some big implications for how companies can use their employee data. So, Derek, can you move the slides for me, please? Yeah. So GDPR may prohibit certain human capital analytical practices. And of course, data, employee data, not just customer data, but employee data, which is what we're focusing on, is increasingly of huge value to companies. And they're using people analytics in so many different areas to drive decisions. So GDPR standards, there are some very big new demands on companies. And as I said before, regulators have given some quite vague instructions. And so companies there's a lot of space for companies to try and work out what they should be doing. And perhaps that's fairly deliberate on the part of the regulator to ensure that companies do err on the side of caution. But the area of legitimate purpose, that's a really important one for companies when they're collecting employee data. They have to demonstrate that they have a legally justifiable purpose. So you can't just collect employee data for one thing and then use it for another. That's not allowed under the law, and I'm sure Tom will give us much more sort of detailed advice around these areas. But knowing why you are collecting your employee data is absolutely essential. Data minimization. You can't just collect your employees' data, which is sensitive personal data, has extra protection on it, because it's nice to have or because more is better. The GDPR actually requires that you process personal data, that you limit it to what is necessary to achieve a very specific, and it has to be a legitimate business purpose. So no more lovely data lakes. You can't just keep that data, hang on to it. And that has some serious implications for how you use data in talent acquisition, in performance management, all sorts of areas. Data retention. The GDPR is also saying that it should not be kept for any longer than is necessary for the purpose for which it's being processed. But how long is that? And again, in the area of recruitment, that's quite a problematic question. The right to be forgotten. So individuals, contingent workers, employees, they have the right at any point to withdraw what is called non-essential human capital data. What might that be? Might it be the data that they've given you in your annual engagement survey? And again, That's a barometer that companies really rely on to see what's happening within their workforce, or the use of pulse surveys, or the fact that companies are starting to implement continuous listening mechanisms. So what happens if an employee decides that they don't want that data to be used any further? Are you geared up to be able to access that data and to retrieve it and to make sure that it has been deleted? And how will that throw will that throw off your statistics, your analysis? So how are you going to manage that? And then profiling. So at the moment, the GDPR just says that profiling must not be automatic. If there are going to be significant consequences, you cannot base that decision solely on automated processing. You have to have humans involved in the loop. And again, maybe profiling is creeping into your operations without you really even necessarily really be thinking about it. For example, I know that some companies are using AI to look at patterns and to predict and for example, someone who might be in danger of leaving. Well, if that analysis leads to differential treatment, and that's an automated process, you could get into trouble under the GDPR. So again, you have to sort of think of all those things. So turning on to the next slide, this means that really we're moving away from a world where there was a power imbalance over personal data, and really the power is on the side of the employer. And I think that what we're seeing and continue to see is this concern that the use of personal data in a technology-mediated world, and people feeling that they're losing control of what's happening, and that data is somehow becoming disconnected and maybe dehumanized from a person. And I think it's significant that Apple's CEO Tim Cook, in a conference in Brussels, and I think he said since then, about this thing about deeply personal data is being weaponized against us with military efficiency. And he received a standing ovation. Now, he might have been talking about that in the context of customers, but your customers are also your employees. Employees are customers. And so some of these societal attitudes, I think, are going to come home to you in your organizations as well. So you can't just say, well, that's out there. It's coming inside the organization. And I think it's a nice point that the Latin for datum literally means something given. It doesn't mean something taken, and yet perhaps that's what companies have been doing. They've been taking personal data, and individuals have inadvertently been given away their personal data. So I think that now what we're seeing is that, on the next slide, is that the GDPR and other regulation like it around the world is flipping that imbalance and has shifted it. And suddenly so much more power has been given to the individual. And I think if you think that GDPR is sort of a cause of this change in people's attitudes, actually it's a symptom, and it's not going to go away. And I think that this shift in how people look at data is just going to continue, and you as business leaders need to really stay in touch with that debate that is going on. So the law has given individuals a whole new raft of powers. And there are organizations out there who are really starting to gear up to ensure that people are availing themselves of their new powers. So for example, one European organization, I think it's called BEUC, complained about the privacy policies of 14 companies. And they did this using an AI tool, I think it's called Claudette, to conduct automated analysis of privacy documents. And they're talking about building a tool into a web crawler that can automatically analyze privacy policies of any organization. So are you geared up for that? And we're also starting to see class action among customers via social media. Will that happen to you? Will employees, will trade unions, will work councils start thinking about class actions? So going on to our next slide, it just means, therefore, that the GDPR and other regulation like this is really starting to challenge how companies are using personal data. These regulations could really inhibit how you use data. They're certainly putting you as a company under so much more closer scrutiny. And some of that scrutiny might be even quite aggressive, depending on who it is. And it also can be used as a weapon. We've actually, that phrase has actually come from some of our member companies who perhaps have had some adversarial relationships with works councils, and they've said, ooh, GDPR can just worsen it. We really have to get our arms around this problem and really find a way of working through this different world. So I think just to wrap up, and I think Klaus is going to talk a little bit more about this. Yes, employee data is subject to all sorts of new restraints, but it also may be that this will benefit the people within your organisations who are really harnessing this data, because actually self-scrutiny and rigour may actually help you as a company. Certainly, we've heard our members say that perhaps greater harmonisation across the EU and actually across the world in other continents, that might actually help, that it might be easier to navigate ultimately the regulation landscape. And I think as well, what we're seeing certainly in our companies is that actually with employee data becoming much more high risk, it is moving up the agenda, it is becoming a C-suite concern, and therefore actually in some ways it's giving new power to human capital analytics. It's making accountability and ownership and governance extremely important, and that could well really play to human capital analytics to its strengths and really position it in a much better way in the organisation, and perhaps to receive much more investment now. So that's really how I think that where we are at the moment in terms of the regulation itself, and I hope that that's just a useful way to set the context. So we're going to turn to Tom, and Tom, I think that you're just going to help us now sort of say, well, what's happening at the moment, but what are you seeing from your perspective as a legal expert? Where are we with the GDPR and other regulation?
Well, thank you, Marion, and thank you for that excellent introduction. I think you hit the nail spot on. The fact that it's kind of a widespread sentiment that basically we're not sure we're ready is something that we see in our daily practice. When we talk to multinational clients, there is kind of a widespread feeling that there is still a lot to be done. Some of them basically say they're not even halfway through, and I think so that they're kind of matches the numbers that you mentioned from the Capgemini report. So that's the bad news in a way. I would say the good news, if that is good news, is that so far the enforcement landscape, if you look at what's happened over the last year and a half in Europe in terms of enforcement, we see that apart from a few very high-profile cases like Marriott and who ran into a significant fine in the UK, Google, who's been fined 50 million euros in France, there's been a recent case in Germany for a housing company that got into trouble for violating various provisions of the GDPR. These were multi-million fines. If you put these aside, because we're really talking about a handful or slightly more than that, but just a minor number. If we put these aside, then we still see that the large majority of other fines that have been imposed are way under the 750,000 euros. So the real Armageddon, as it was announced pre-GDPR, it was going to happen. We don't see that happening right now. It might be, we're just guessing why that is. One is perhaps that supervisory authorities needed to gear their own resources internally up in the ramp up to the GDPR. They've, I think, rightly prioritized awareness raising over enforcement. So that perhaps in part explains where we are now in terms of enforcement. This, however, we expect that to change. So we will see more enforcement, more proactive enforcement in the next few quarters, we think. Again, 2 points. One, the amount of fines might not be the biggest deterrent for the average multinational company. We're not in the US, we're in Europe, where we have a much lower or much less of a litigation, contentious-driven society. And again, supervisory authorities are still preferring awareness raising over enforcement. But this being said, we're now 18 months further. So the excuse that we used to have in the first couple of weeks or months after the deadline, after the entry into application of GDPR, that becomes kind of very incredible argument. Well, we didn't have time. Well, yes, we have had time. And by the way, it's not just from the 25th of 2018 that we had time. We actually had time since 2016 when the whole piece of law entered into force, legally speaking. So that is no longer a strong excuse. So I think that's the first trend that we see on the market. Another trend that we see is personal data breaches. Not that there are, in our view, a lot more breaches than there used to be, say, 5 years ago, but the organizations have become much more sensitive to incidents of all sorts. And it can range from the traditional CryptoLocker attack, someone clicked on the wrong link on a Monday morning, not being very assertive, and then all of a sudden the entire environment got crypto locked. And so what are you going to do? Is this a personal data breach? You bring your IT folks in, your legal folks, and I think generally speaking, organizations have underestimated the sheer amount of time, management time that requires, and also the number of incidents that come through.
And the GDPR requires you to report within 72 hours.
That is true. Right? Report that to the authorities within 72 hours. And then if it really is a significant incident with a potential high risk for individuals, then you also need to reach out to the individuals. So this is really become a very contentious area. Unfortunately, the regulatory framework isn't very clear on the threshold as from what moment on you need to notify that incident to a regulator. So that is a big thing. And we have a lot of work coming on. That is a major source actually for work for lawyers, but also for forensic experts, of course, because reporting an incident also means that you're supposed to understand what happened, what is the root cause, what did you do to kind of, weed out that problem and to manage the situation to mitigate the consequences.
Which is a pretty tall order within 72 hours, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And I think, hard to stick a number to that, but I think a significant part of the incidents that we've notified over the last year and a half was done in a two-tiered way. So we first, notified the authority with incomplete data, basically saying, yes, we know there is an incident and we have a strong feeling that this kind of triggers the threshold for notification. So here we are, but this is a provisional notification. We'll follow up as soon as we can to kind of complete that notification, which is a bit tricky because you go to a regulator, that's a point of no return. You don't have the advantage of the doubt anymore. And so you might end up being in a situation that after investigation you realize, well, actually, it did not trigger that threshold. So we're going to, withdraw that. And that, of course, is a bit of a tricky step because, you've gone out, you've put your cards on the table, and you expose yourself to regulatory scrutiny. But yes, so that's a major source of work. And I think if I look back 2 years ago, I think when people were organizing and getting themselves ready for the GDPR, that is a piece of work that's been structurally underestimated. So the handling of incidents, making sure that the incidents come through, that's the first point within the organization. The readiness as to, do we have standard operating procedures in place to kind of, assess the incident. All these things have taken a lot more time in reality than people thought, say, 2 years ago. So that's another trend. It's another trend is international sharing of data, intragroup, and this touches upon HR data as much as it does touch upon customer data. Because, of course, for those who are not yet using kind of centralized cloud-based, very often US-based solutions, they are moving towards that, right? HR information systems like Workday or Taleo, who are increasingly centralized. That also means that, wherever your operations sit, all those data, these HR data are being centralized onto one single platform, means sharing of data across borders. And, some of you might know that Europe has this arrogance to say that basically your data is safe only when they reside and remain within the European Union, but as soon as they are exposed, as they leave European Union, they become accessible to non-European, then actually you have an issue because many laws outside of Europe don't offer the same standard of data privacy. Now, I won't go into the technicalities of this, but this has caused a lot of nervosity. Well, we need to perhaps roll out intra-company agreements that embed or incorporate certain regulated terms and conditions. This is a very popular tool these days for multinational companies to try and mitigate the risks when they share data internationally. We see an increasing number of organizations now looking to V.2, if I can call it this way, to a next level of data sharing and a more robust compliance tool to make sure that you can share data in a compliant way, which is called binding corporate rules. Someone, 10 years ago called it privacy for the rich because it's quite a comprehensive program. It means that not just your European operations should comply with the standards, European standards, but actually you make these binding upon your non-European operations, which is of course a totally different ballgame. But we see that there is an increasing appetite and eagerness amongst multinational companies to actually go into that next level of compliance.
Where does that eagerness come from? Is it because ultimately they think it just makes sense, or is it a concern with their brand, or is it a risk management preference?
I think it's a good question because the main source, I think, is that people realize that these intra-company or intra-group agreements are actually quite unmanageable, because it's really, having hundreds, if not thousands, of different entities across the globe signing up to one agreement, and then there's various annexes, and it becomes very complicated as soon as there's a new system being added onto your HR information system landscape. You need to change that, and then you need to roll it out, etc. So it's a practicality, but second, also it's because organizations feel the need to become more sophisticated when it comes to GDPR compliance. So that's another source, another reason, actually, I think, for this eagerness. And then, of course, Brexit has also been speeding up this whole discussion. Brexit, if the UK leaves
the only thing that Brexit is speeding up, and everything else, it seems to be slowing everything else down.
Exactly, yeah. So if there's going to be a no deal, then that basically means that upon Brexit, the UK will no longer be an adequate country, as we call it in the jargon. That means that it doesn't offer sufficient level of data protection in the eyes of the Europeans, and therefore if you make your data available to subsidiaries or your headquarters in the UK, that basically means a transfer to call it a naughty country, so to say. So you need to implement certain safeguards. And of course, by far and large, the most successful or most popular safeguard these days are the standard contractual clauses. So these are terms and conditions that have been approved by European Union. And if you roll these out and have these signed with your UK subsidiaries or UK entity, then you can actually share this. But of course, it's perceived as being a big risk. I don't think it's it's the biggest of all risks under GDPR, but it's something that you need to deal with because it's relatively straightforward, and there's little excuse come the day that there's going to be a Brexit. Little excuse if you haven't taken that into account. There's a couple of other things that we also see. Data subject requests. I think you already briefly mentioned that, Marianne, in your introductory part. Very good point. And so we see a clear increase of individuals going out to their employers and asking for access to their data. Unsurprisingly, I would say the number of requests that comes up in the context of difficult situations, like applicants that have been refused for a job or people that have been dismissed, there you see the highest number of requests coming through. Really? And of course, it's the sort of thing that is very often difficult to deal with, because in many countries, there is no excuse not to show the data that you hold about an individual. So some countries like the UK and Ireland have built into their national laws exceptions to the access rights, basically saying, well, if any communication, for instance, that contains HR data is privileged, then if you meet a certain standard, you don't have to disclose those data or those communications. Unfortunately, on the continent, there's only a very, very limited number of countries that do have that exception. So basically the rule is, whenever you communicate about individuals, about your workforce, and whenever you write anything down, put anything in a system, just be mindful that at some point in time, someone might ask access to that data.
So, for example, I know that quite a few of our participants today come from talent acquisition. So, example, if you had interviewed a candidate, people had made notes, people had given their feedback about the candidate, that's data in the system, isn't it? That you've got to try and sort of fish out and make sure you know where it is, etc. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we can always talk a little bit about some of those things in greater detail. But I think it would be good to turn to Klaus now. And Klaus, you are a people analytics expert, and I think that something that you've obviously been really debating in your field with other experts is, you know, in this world of much tighter legislation, what is going to happen to people analytics? Do you think it's going to be a curse or is it going to be a blessing? What do you think, Klaus?
Well, we gathered last year, we gathered a group of peers around the topics, and they were all members, but also Fortune 500 companies, people who are responsible for people analytics in their field. And we had the challenging question, is GDPR a threat or a blessing in disguise? What everybody should know is that in the field of human capital analytics, we only started to harvesting the incredible information and insights which are in the data for the last 5 to 8 years. So it's a fairly new area. So we gathered with them and we talked about ethics and we talked about what could come out of it. And I would like to share with everybody here the outcome of those sessions. First is what are the positives of GDPR, because it's regulation, it's law, and we are not normally perceiving it as something which is really helping us, but hindering us. Now, it forces clear communication of what people analytics does. It sets a new standard. So what makes it important is that before we start a project, everybody should be aware of how to communicate what we are doing and how we are going to bring benefits to the organization. It will create more transparency. In the short term, it might make things in the short term a little bit more difficult, but it will make them better in the long run. It's just like drilling for oil down in Alaska. You shouldn't do that just because you can do that. You should think about it. What are the consequences? So that's also on the positive side. HR data is also in IT systems, so we must find the responsibility to have a process owner. You can't just share it around. Because we're talking about people, we're talking about trust, we're talking about building their companies. Personal data is also valuable positively, so the framework has created rules. Now we have rules, and now we can play by the rules. So we can invite people to share information as long as it's not being able to fire back to themselves. And it also gives people analytics the position to be more prominent in the business, because if you should be careful about the data, top management might be aware that it might be incredibly important. So business leaders will go to people analytics and ask it. So those are on the positive side. But of course, there are also some negatives. If we in Europe are by law forced to be more strict on using our people analytic data, and people analytic data can bring us actionable and scalable insights in how to improve our company. So not focusing on the individual, but with people analytics, you want to see how we can benefit all from just looking and analyzing and building the algorithms of the data. What competencies will help the company further to the future? So, for example, one of the hot topics is the skills for the future now. So what are the skills? What's going to help us in the future? And other regions, if they are allowed to use more data, it can have a disadvantage. Machine learning is one of the things we are using nowadays, so a lot of intelligence used over there. It's a question mark there. How can we use it? We just can't throw the data in and wait till something comes out. Still, framed as negative. Digital learning, everybody is putting in data there, and how can we use it, or how can't we use it? So it also has something to do with to be compliant, because you have to keep data to show that people are, for example, allowed to go for safety reasons to an oil platform. Yeah, work councils. You can see them as an enemy because they can use GDPR as a weapon. It also, and that's the other part, it also forces you to work together with works councils because everybody wants to work on an improvement in their company and also have people to work with more pleasure. The aging workforce, you could also argue, people getting older, not that digital anymore. Are we going to lose their people? And based on the GDPR, we will rule them out. The problems of employees don't link people analytics with anything positive because people analytics has the only objective is to improve for the employer, for the employee, and for the company. But it can be put in a totally different framework. And diversity of complexity of the law. We have, for example, the people in that organization, they have 66 countries, understanding the GDPR and how we can put across. But I think Tom can help them better than I can on that territory. So we written a manifesto. They written a manifesto with 11 points in it. And the first one was start with the business question and define the purpose. So if there's no business question, why should you look for data? So not data, not nice to know, but what do you need to know to improve? Together with a sponsor or a business owner, ask that question. Somebody should own that question, and not just algorithms doing things. The third thing the executive said over there was focus on the positive actions. Insights should be actionable, as I already said, and scalable. So why should we make the same mistake over and over again? The fourth one is openness and transparency. Openness and transparency. So everybody should know what we're doing. So we love GDPR there. Communicate to employees. So tell them what you're doing. So I'm often in the field that I collect data, and Tom is right, because when I was measuring together with Capgemini a couple of years ago, they were very strict on data privacy and how to use it, and it looks that it's not that far as we already thought it was up front, but still communicate to the employees. Why are you collecting the data? How are you going to use it? And how is it not going to backfire to them? Think much sooner about the potential benefits to the employees. So also explain to them the benefits. Be defensible, but not defensive. So think up front, is it legally, are we doing legally the right things? And not just afterwards. Deal with aggregated data. So we are not interested in personal data as such. We are interested in aggregated data because there are the analytics, there is the information, there we can learn new things. If it's just about you and me, then it could be totally different there. Because then you should deal with your manager. Stay courageous, ask the courageous questions. So I know that a company who didn't collect the data in the right way had to delete all their company data on their staff.
That could be disastrous, Klaus. If you were a very large multinational company, well, any company, that could be a real disaster.
That could be a disaster. So be really active up front and know what you're asking. So involve works councils. They are a partner, not the enemy. Involve the labor union. They are a partner, not a threat, because they all want the same thing. They only want to have a fair deal with the employees. Collaborate with IT, legal, and data protection. So don't start a project without checking with legal within the company. Don't start it. Why? Go to IT up front. Think up front. And it should be value driven. Prudence, temperance, courage, and justice. So this is what the group, and I think we were about 15 high executives talking about the topic for more than 2 days. We talked about ethics. We talked about the opportunities. And in the end, everybody said it's a blessing in disguise. Because if we are acting according to the law, everybody knows the data is being used in the right way, and it will help people in the organization and the organization further without hurting the individual.
Yeah.
So that's what was over then. They spoke about it, and since then I've been working in the same field, and I'll see that every project starts differently than before. And I also see that the board is asking more and more people data, knowing that it's being collected in the right and in a sustainable way.
Thank you, Klaus. So I think that what I'm hearing really is that companies, the clients that you're dealing with, the companies that you see, Klaus, they're starting in one area, which is all about compliance, but they're actually ending in a different area, which seems to be much more around ethics and much more around thinking about what privacy means to people, what transparency means. You're talking about values here, about being courageous, collaborative, etc. So, Tom, is this something that, from your viewpoint as a legal specialist, is there a case for trust, transparency, all these sort of the ethical side of employee data management?
Well, yes, I think, and increasingly so. So, I completely agree that, just doing the thing that complies with the GDPR for many organizations, that is not the end of the story, I think. But of course, the GDPR in itself has built in certain of these values. Like, I like the word trust, and of course, one of the essential components of trust is, tell people what you do with their data. Mm-hmm. That is one of the cornerstones in the GDPR. And now, it's easy to say, well, tell them what you do. And this is where the lawyer comes up, and we only need to be careful, well, how are we going to tell them that? And second, what are we going to say? Because it's always a matter of striking the right balance. Be transparent, but don't be too transparent. In some areas, you might need to be a little more cautious in what you say. Not that you have to hide something, but you might be contradicting yourself. And that is one thing. The second thing is, we still see too many, lawyerish, lengthy privacy policies, privacy statements, what have you. And for me, difficult to predict trends. I haven't got a crystal ball, but I wouldn't be surprised if in the coming years there's going to be more regulatory scrutiny on exactly how organizations enter into a dialogue with, whether it be their workers or their customers, etc. And hopefully, by that time, we'll all have done away with these 5-10 pages of privacy statements. I think we need to become much more intelligent in the way we explain what we do. Q&A type of documents, it's proven. There's nothing sophisticated in this. Do have a lot more, are a lot more accessible to people. They can click on the question they want to be answered, and that's it. They don't have to weed through a very lengthy document. Second, layered approach. Transparency starts with simplicity, right? So you can have a top layer, very short statement that says, beware, we're going to do this and that. And if you wanted to hear further or have more information on what we're going to do, well, click here and you can have a second layer, which is slightly more detailed, but still not the 10-pager that I was talking about,
but with employees, isn't there something, doesn't the GDPR say something about the fact that employees' consent in itself isn't enough because, the power balance is not equal? Yeah.
Well, that's the other thing. So talking about trends, people are saying, well, the GDPR is new, has introduced this novelty, consent has become much stricter. Well, I disagree with that. The GDPR is not new on that front. The directive already had, so the previous law already was quite strict on consent. The only thing was certain member states have given it their own twists and have been slightly more lenient, if I can use that word. Now Europe said, listen, consent means prior opt-in, and it needs to be a free consent. That is, you should be able to kind of choose whether or not to accept that, which is very often, at least according to European lawmakers, not the case if you're an employee because you find yourself into a subordinate position. Mm-hmm. For me, this is a case to actually try and do away with consent at the workplace and only use consent there where there's no other option. We still see that there's, especially Anglo-Saxon American British companies, still attach too much importance to consent, thinking that it's actually
So what
it's
should
the
they
safest
be doing?
option.
What should they be doing instead then, do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't want to go into the technicalities of the legal framework, but there's something called legitimate interest. And if you can organize the way you handle data in such a way that there is a balance between your own interests as an employer versus the privacy interests and the other rights and freedoms of individuals, you can get away without having to ask for an explicit consent. And very often that'll be the case. Now, of course, I'm not even talking about the easier cases where you as an employer have a legal obligation to handle certain data. Think about payroll or tax-related information. Then, of course, you have a ground because you're required by virtue of local law to handle certain data. But I think legitimate interest is still slightly underestimated, if I can use that word, for handling data. The drawback is there's no legal certainty until and unless someone's going to test it, right?
Yes,
and of course, that is something that organizations by their very nature don't like.
I mean, with this thing about what's legitimate. So if you as an employer said, yes, we use facial recognition, but we use it for security, we use it for entry into premises, whatever.
Right.
It's a legitimate reason. Is that good enough? And what would happen if an employee said, I don't want you to use facial recognition technology with me?
Right, exactly.
I mean, what happens there?
Yeah. I mean, the easy examples are hospitals or, organizations that handle very sensitive information, or organizations that need to roll out, very robust security measures, like, organizations operating power stations, nuclear power stations. Of course, they have a certain, reason for protecting their facilities, etc. This is easy, but it becomes more difficult when you're actually going to do advanced analytics into data just to reduce the degree of absenteeism, for instance, in organizations, and you're going to handle also health, related information. It's not just about the reason why you do it, it's also about the how you handle those data. So if you can actually roll out certain measures, call them controls, to reduce the risk that could stem from that kind of data handling, then you're much more likely to be able to say, listen, I have a legitimate interest. So people very often think only just about the reason why they'd be handling the information. Also think about measures that you could take. For instance, before you're going to handle those healthcare information, pseudonymize that information before it gets into the system. Reduce the number of individuals that sit behind the buttons in the system. Reduce the duration during which the data are going to be retained, and very important, be very transparent to the individuals. You could even be more transparent there because you want to use that as an argument to say, listen, I've rebalanced those conflicting interests by actually telling individuals. And yes, oddly enough, offering individuals a right to refuse could also be used to say, yes, you have a legitimate interest, because you actually give them more control than you'd normally in a legal framework would require. And that could be one of the many arguments that, if you put them all together, say, okay, well, there's conflicting interests, but on balance, we think they're in check.
Klaas, have you got anything to add here in terms of around consent and balance?
I like what Thomas just said. If you have a company, and this is a real case, where you have a sickness rate of 10%, which is incredibly high for that company, and you want to lower it with 1%, it will bring them tens of millions of money. And if you do people analytics over there, which they did, totally pseudonymized, as you suggested, Tom, then you saw that 30% of that 1%, which would save, let's say 50 million, it's even more, but 30% could be reached by giving the employee and the employee more autonomy in their work. So you could save 15 million euros by giving people more autonomy in their work and giving them a more happy life, because they make their own decisions, and there's a lot to tell about it. But there you can see, and then Tom is totally right, if you set up the research in the right question, in the right way, and you inform the people, and you don't need the individual data, but you need the collective data, and you even can put it somewhere else in the system of outside the organization or not reachable, but then you still can have the profits on both sides. The employee is protected, has got a job. The organization is not using individual data, has a better, reaches a better result. And there you can see that's the search for new answers using machine learning, using data, using analytics, and go hand in hand by having the legal framework used in the right way. Just that's what I would like to add what Tom said.
And in terms of, for both of you, I mean, companies are obviously turning to AI-based tools. It's very early, but they are starting to use machine learning-based approaches. There's been a lot of concern about algorithms. I mean, do you think, is there any advice that you would give companies who are starting down this path? What should they be bearing in mind at this stage?
Klaas, you go first.
Oh, yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to kick down by the lawyer now. No, I say use it, but use it in a sensible way, and use it with all the legal restrictions, because the basis of the law, and I think we both said it, it's trust, and it was already in the privacy regulations before. So it's trust. Don't misuse that trust, and then you're acting by the meaning of the law. And in the same way, use it because it will help you. It will empower your organization. It will give new insights, and we will be able to build another kind of company. So use it, but be aware of that you use it in a sensible way, and don't use it just to go in the data and see, can we find something interesting. Start with a question, with a business question in mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say put your vendors at work. I mean, many of these tools are not your own tools, and you source them on the market. Very often organizations tend to underestimate the potential for challenging your prospective vendors, even at the stage of going out with an RFP on the market, and basically say, listen, I'm inviting, 5 to 10 potential vendors. As part of your proposal, we're interested not just in the price and your solution itself, but also in the way you've actually designed your product so that there is privacy by design, privacy by default in your product. And actually, you kind of shift the workload a little bit to your vendors, make them also accountable, and actually, use the responses as one of the criteria to assess overall the vendors and to choose the right vendor. It's a way of shifting the workload, but also it's a way of documenting your own accountability, because as an employer, you're supposed to be, you're required to be accountable on GDPR. Well, it's actually one of the ways to demonstrate it, even when a regulator would come and knock your door and say, listen, did you do your homework? Yes, we did. Here it was. It was a question that all our vendors needed to respond to as part of the procurement process. Now, there's a flip side to that, of course, because if you ask that question, you're going to get an answer. And if that answer is not satisfactory, you nevertheless go ahead with that vendor, you might need to think through your argumentation, your justification for nevertheless choosing that vendor.
Yes. Yeah. Which is a risk.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt there, but you're very right there, Tom. And when I'm on the vendor part, I can see that more and more companies are requiring this from us. And so you can see companies who are dealing and handling people data, they should be aware of how they work, and they should work along the rules. You're right there. I think that's one of their basic approaches in their companies.
Mm-hmm. But I think a question, obviously this is a very complex area. For a senior HR human capital person in an organization, many of our audience today are very senior people. Is it a case of, should they just hand it over to IT specialists, to lawyers, to, how much should this stay within their remit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little double, because in a way the business needs need to be defined by HR folks. I think that is clear. It's not IT that is going to be defining the business requirements, and of course there's a little risk there that already in the stage of spelling out the business requirements that we make a little mistake by requiring something that we know clearly is off the mark of GDPR. So I think this would be kind of joint effort between legal and HR in a way. And of course, IT, well, I think procurement needs to be involved when it comes to, pitching the right questions and making sure that, privacy compliance, privacy by design is being taken into account as part of the procurement process. So there is clearly a role.
Of course, contingent workers, you have to include them in all of this.
Exactly.
Then procurement are often dealing with those contracts and everything.
Correct. Yeah.
Klaus, have you anything to add there?
No, I agree totally there. And I think this is crucial to your business. So as an HR executive, you should know where you're dealing with. I wouldn't be, it's not possible that somebody else handles your basic purpose in your work. So HR should be involved. They should know it's not about GDPR. It's about the privacy right of the individual in your organization.
Yes.
So it's a core value of our society.
Yeah.
So please be aware of that.
And I think actually, I think this is what we saw in our research that we've done at the conference board, is that privacy is a deeply personal. Data protection is one thing, but privacy is something that's deeply personal. It varies across cultures. And I think as well, anyone that's got millennial offspring, you can see generational differences in a big way. What I could consider private, my own children do not necessarily think of private at all. So that's, I think we get back again to discussion, don't we, to dialogue. And again, HR is so well positioned to lead that. I think we've got a couple more minutes. Just one little word, if I may ask you about works councils. Because with the GDPR, works councils do have a right, don't they, to at least to be informed, but sometimes they can advise and they even have the ability to sort of say yay or nay. Is that right?
Yeah, and so the unfortunate thing about works councils is that their powers, so to say, depend from one member state to the other. So it's not a harmonized area of law. Basically meaning that, if you're rolling out kind of a new, totally novel, innovative system, say an AI-based recruitment tool, that you might have very different answers depending on the member state in which you're rolling it out. There's countries where works councils do have quite a bit of a say, and that is, for instance, in Germany. They're very, very powerful. In other countries like in the UK or Ireland, and I'm not a specialist in English or Irish law, but from our practice we can really see that there is a lot less weight that works councils over there can give. Generally speaking, if there's something innovative and slightly disruptive at the workplace, make yourselves ready for I wouldn't say difficult conversations, but conversations that go a little deeper. And indeed, in some countries, you might need to have a prior approval from the works council. Yeah.
And I think that's really important, because a lot of our companies are going through they're going through digital transformation, and again, HR, human capital, is being transformed by technology. So yes, innovative, disruptive. I think that's very much what HR is about today, and human capital in general.
What we also sometimes see in practice that these works councils have their own external counsel. I'm not saying that's bad. The only thing is, you should prepare to that and make sure that your legal folks, whenever there's this kind of somewhat delicate subject to be put on the table of a works council meeting, that you're prepared, because they might come along with their own external advice and say, well, actually, we've heard something very different. So why do you say this, and blah, blah, blah. And, well, they might not always have the same budget as you, so sometimes their external counsel might not be as specialized as you, which in a way is not always the best thing, because then they are ill-advised on certain points. So that's something to be taken into account as well.
Klaus, you have a few seconds. Is there anything that you want to add about works councils?
Yeah, they are our partners, not our enemies.
Absolutely.
So and we are not in a fight, but inform them. And if you inform them in the right moment, the right stage, then they will be very constructive partners.
Yeah.
In most cases.
So this is such a big area. I feel like we've just scraped the surface, and we've come to the end of our time. I think, in terms of any feedback from you, if there are some areas that you really would like us to go into detail a lot more, do please tell us, and that would be really useful. And Klaus and Tom, thank you so much for your input
Pleasure.
today and your time. Really appreciate that. And I guess I'm going to just pass it to you to say, Tom, what would you like our audience, if there was one thing for them to take away, what would it be? And Klaus, be ready as well for that same question.
Yeah, I think we've already said it quite a lot of times. Transparency is key, and it'll continue to be a key element, cornerstone of your privacy and compliance program.
Klaus?
Start with a business question.
Start with
and
business
trust people.
Okay, and if we're talking about transparency, trust, the business question, we're talking about HR and human capital leaders with a vengeance. So I think my takeaway would be, don't abdicate, don't give that space to other people, lead it and stay in there. Anyway, that's all we have for today. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this webcast. It will be on our website in the next 24 hours. Please do share it. We'd love to hear from you. And as I say, if there's any topic that you particularly want us to look at, please do tell us and we'll do our best. So thank you.